So today's class is basically divided into three sections. So for the first section, we have that to be Introduction to the Document Object Model. Now, under this section, we'll talk about what the document object model is. We'll also look at the structure of the document object model, and we'll also see the benefits of this document object model and what it can do for us with JavaScript. So after this section, we move on to the next section, which is about the methods and the document object. Now, within the DOMs, there are some particular methods that are, very, very important in the entire working of the DOM. So under this section, we'll see some basic methods. So like I said, this is just an introductory class. We will not see the entire methods of the DOM. We would only see the basic methods. We would also see the document object, and would also get to see the syntax between the method and the document object, because the methods under the DOM, they are quite a lot, but we'll see the basic ones. And for the syntax of the methods within the DOM, they're actually connected to the document object, so we'll see how this connection actually appears in this section. Now for the third and final section, we'll be seeing the properties. And under this section, we'll get to see the properties of the DOM. So we'll get to know about the different properties within the DOM, and we'll be seeing some basic properties of the DOM. We'll also get to see the syntax and also the example. And as we all know, after every class, we'd always have a practical demo on what we have learned so far. So we'll actually be seeing the DOM, the methods, and the properties and everything put together. For the first section, we have Introduction to the Document Object Model. Now, what is a document object model, or what you would call the document object model, since it's just one? The document object model, which is also short for DOM, that's DOM, is a programming interface for web documents. Now, the DOM actually is an important part of being able to render a web document. Most of us might not know this, but it's very, very important. And another reason why it's important is because of the fact that it defines the logical structure of HTML documents. So before any HTML document is rendered, there is this structure that is actually created, and this particular structure is what would actually let the browser know the different parts of this document. So the DOM here defines the logical structure. It also defines the access and manipulation of this HTML document. Now with the DOM, JavaScript can actually access and change elements within a HTML document. So I know so far so good. At this point, we already know how to change HTML elements using CSS and probably some very, very few HTML attributes. But here with the DOM, we'd actually get to know how JavaScript can also change elements within HTML documents. So I know for some people here, they might find it a bit odd, or they might find it a bit confusing, because we actually believe that the CSS is the only part, only language that is used to make changes to HTML elements. Mind you, the JavaScript can also do that. Probably not as good as CSS, since it's majorly for styling, but here the JavaScript can also make some kind of changes to HTML elements. So whenever a web page is loaded, the browser creates a document object model of that web page, and that document object model appears to be a tree-like structure of objects. So this basically means that either a HTML document or a hosted web page, in as much as it's loaded into the browser when rendering that web page would actually create a document object model. Now, the document object model is like a structure. Like I said, it's a tree-like structure. It's in form of a tree, and we all know how a tree actually looks like. It just has a particular starting point, and then it spreads into different branches. So that's how the document object model actually appears to be. Now, the objects within this document object model are actually represented as the different elements of the HTML document. So regardless of if it's a HTML document or a hosted web page, the DOM actually has this structure. Now within this structure are objects. You know the way a tree is. From the starting point, it goes and it divides into different branches. That's exactly how the DOM appears too. It has a starting point, and from that starting point it divides the objects, into branches. Now, these objects are actually the HTML elements that we have within the document. So that means from the very first part of the HTML document, which mostly begins with the doc type HTML tag, it would actually spread out to other elements and to every content of that HTML document. And we'll get to see how the structure looks like in the next slide. Now, for a very, very brief example of the dome structure, this particular structure we are seeing is not, the structure of an entire dome. It's not the structure of an entire web page, but it's just a very, very brief diagram of what the dome actually looks like. So you can see that from the first part of the dome, it begins with the document. So the document actually is the root node, or what you would call the root object of this DOM. By the word root, we mean the very first object, the first, um, you know, the first entity. That's what the root actually means. So the document we are seeing here is actually the root object. So this document is what represents your HTML document or your web page. It actually represented here. And now from this document, the next object that comes after it directly is the very first tag in your HTML document, which we all know to be the HTML tag itself. So for those that might have it to be doc type HTML, it's still the same thing. It's actually the very first element here. And now after this element, we actually have the next two categories of elements, which is the head and the body. So this structure of the DOM appears to be in a kind of hierarchical order, and it actually begins with the document at the first level, the HTML element at the second level, then we have the head and the body at the third level. So this head element here and this body element here, they're actually equal when it comes to their structure in the entire hierarchy. Now, after the head here, we have the title tag. We all know what the title tag is. It's where we put the name of, um, you know, the particular page. And we also have our meta tags. We are already conversant with, what the meta tags are. Now, you might be wondering that we did not have the link tags here, but the link tags are actually in the same hierarchy with the title and the meta tag. So it's actually safe to say that they are all on the same level. Now going to the body, we have after the body we have the HTML elements themselves. So here we have the P element, which is just a quick example of an HTML element. We also have the anchor tag, another HTML element. So what this means is that all HTML elements are actually on the same hierarchy when it comes to how they appear on the structure of the DOM. And now after the elements themselves, the next Okay, before we get to the next level, you can see that beside the anchor tag is the href attribute. So this actually means that the attributes and the elements, they are quite on the same level. I think so. Yeah, hopefully I guess so, that they are on the same level like this. But the very last part of the entire structure is always the content of the HTML element, which you can see at the last section here. So after the p element, we have the text, which is equals to sale tech, and for the anchor element, we have the home text here. So for the going over the DOM again, we begin with the HTML page itself, which is this document here at the first level. Next, we have the HTML tag, which is the highest tag in terms of the entire structure of your HTML elements. Then we have the head and the body. Now, after the head and the body, we have the elements within the head and the body. Here we have title and meta. And for the body, we have the p tag and the anchor tag, and also the attributes. And for the last level, we have the actual content within the HTML element. So for the title here, we have the document text, and for the paragraph element, we have the sale tech, which is a text element, and we also have the home text here for the anchor. So you can see that the DOM actually structures them, beginning with the document, the HTML, the head and the body, the tags within the head and the body, and lastly the content within those tags. So that's how the entire structure of the DOM looks like. So here we'll get to see what the DOM can actually do. And now, with the use of the DOM, JavaScript can one, change all the HTML elements in a page. So now you can now understand that you cannot just change the HTML elements with just CSS. Even JavaScript can do that too. And after that, aside changing the HTML elements, JavaScript can also change all HTML attributes. Now, this doesn't mean that you can change from one attribute to another. No. What this means is that you can change the value of an attribute. So we already know what these attributes are. For instance, if we should take the image element as an example, the image element has an attribute which we all know to be the source attribute. Now, an attribute and a style, they are not the same. They are two different things entirely. So for the width and the height in within the image element, you can actually call them attributes, but then they are also styles. But the source in the image element is actually an attribute, and with the DOM in JavaScript, you can actually change the value of that source attribute. So I would also show you how that is possible with the DOM. Also, JavaScript can change all CSS styling in a page with the use of the DOM. So, like I said before, we are already familiar with how we can change HTML styling with CSS, but then even JavaScript can actually change the CSS stylings of HTML elements. Another thing the DOM can do is to also remove existing HTML elements and attributes. So this has to do with actually taking them out of what is rendered. You're not taking them out of the code necessarily anyway, but you're going to take them out of what is being rendered on the screen. And you can also add new HTML elements and attributes with the DOM, as we can see on the fifth what's it called list here. Now for the last two, which is the sixth and the seventh, the DOM can react to all HTML events in a page. Now I know that many of us might not know what an HTML event is, but hopefully if there's time we would actually go through that when we are talking about the events under the DOM, and it can also create new HTML events within a page. So all these things that we have on the screen is what the DOM can actually help us to do through JavaScript. So next we have methods and the document object. So for this section, we'll be seeing the different methods within the DOM. And I made mention that the methods are a lot, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll just go with the basic ones that we already know, and then some few ones that we'll get to know newly about today. So here we have the basic methods of the DOM. Now, the methods of the DOM enables a user to access and change the content of the HTML document. Now, such methods can be seen as we have the first method, which is the dot right with the normal bracket method. We have the dot right ln method. We have the dot get element by ID. I believe we are already aware of this one because we've been making use of this ever since we started JavaScript. And also we have the dot get element by name. It's also a method under the DOM. We also have the dot get element by tag name. And lastly, we have the dot get element by class name. So these six methods we have on the screen are not the only methods that are limited to the DOM. The DOM actually has a lot of methods, like it's a lot, but these are just the basic ones that we would make use of most of the times, except in some other very very should I say rare cases. But then knowing about the other ones is just as important too. But like I said before, we'd only just focus on the basic ones. So before we move on, if you look at the six of them, we've already touched two of these methods, and that's the very first method, which is the dot right method, which I made mention that it's only for testing purposes. And we've also made use of the dot get element by ID, which would actually make changes to the HTML element and output the value assigned to it on the screen. So for the rest of the four methods that we are new to, we'll see a practical demo on each of them, and we'll also see how it actually works on VS Code. So for the first method, the dot write method, the dot write method writes out the given string on the HTML document. Now, this particular method necessarily doesn't only write strings. You can actually assign a variable name, an identifier, a function name, whatever identifier you have, you can output it through the document.write. It's just basically used generally for outputting, and I believe we all know about this method already. Next, we have the dot write ln method. Now, this method is very, very similar to the one we saw previously, which was the dot write method. The only difference here is the fact that it actually outputs the string on the HTML document with a new line character. So what this means is that rather than having the element on the same line, it will actually take it to a new line that's a different space on its own, because by default JavaScript is an inline level element, but with this particular method we are going to have our text on a new line. Next, we have the get element by ID method. Now, many of us are already popular with this method. In fact, we already know this method because we've made use of this right from the second class of JavaScript. So this particular method returns the HTML element that possesses the specified ID name. So this means that this method would return the contents of any HTML element that has the ID name that was specified. So we already know how to make use of, this particular method, but for the sake of today's class, we'll be going over it again. Now, the fourth method we have here is the get element by name method. So the get element by name method actually returns all the HTML elements that possess the specified name. So here we already know that some HTML elements have this name attribute, and so this particular method actually work for those elements, and it returns all the HTML elements. Mind you, this actually deals with more than one HTML element, unlike the get element by ID, which only deals with one HTML element. This particular method deals with multiple HTML elements in as much as they have the name attributes assigned to it. And I think one of the popular HTML elements with the name attribute is actually the input tag. So this with this particular method, you can actually select multiple input tags and make changes to them however you want it. The next one we have is the .get element by tag name. Of course, we this should be self-explanatory since we already know that it ends with the tag name. Now, the .get element by tag name method returns all the HTML elements that possess the specified tag name. So we all know what a tag name is. You have the paragraph element which has the P, which is between the um greater than sign and less than sign, which actually represent the tags. So the P there is the tag name. For the heading elements, we have the heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4 to be their tag names. So this particular method can actually return all HTML elements that have a specified tag name. So if we had a case where we use this to connect to the P tag name, it would actually connect to every HTML element that has that P tag name or that is a paragraph element. So that's what this method actually does. And lastly, we have the .get element by class name. So this also does the same thing as the rest. The only difference here is that it returns all the HTML elements with a particular class name. So you can guess now the reason why we have the get element by ID to return just one element, and we have the get element by name, by tag name, and by class name to return multiple elements. And that's actually because I made mention that the ID is always unique per element. So you can never have multiple IDs within different HTML elements. And because the ID names are unique, you can only return one element at a time. And that is exactly the reason why the get element by ID actually returns just one element. So for you to return another element with an ID name which is unique, you would need to write the syntax again. But unlike the tag name, the name, and the class name which we have on the screen now, the three of them actually return different multiple HTML elements. And we already know that the class name can be repeated. multiple HTML elements can have the same class name. So because of this, you can actually return all the HTML elements with the same class name, also with the same tag name and with the same name, but not the same ID names, since ID names cannot be the same. So that's actually like a quick and brief, explanation of all these methods. For now, we do not have their syntax, and this is because their syntax is connected to the document object, which will be seen in the next slide. So here we have the document object. Now, if you remember very well from the structure of the DOM, I made mention that the root object of the DOM is actually the document object. So this document object here actually represents that very first beginning of the structure of the DOM. That's the part where we had the document before the HTML element. So as I said before, the document here represents your HTML document or your web page. So the document object actually represents the entire web page or the entire HTML document. Now, to access any element in a HTML page, it would require that a user goes through the document object first. So you can see that obviously from the structure of the DOM. The DOM begins with the document, which is then followed by the very first element in your HTML document, which is the HTML element. After the HTML element, you have the next two, which is the head and the body. Now, within the head and the body, you have other elements which, you know, are on the same level like that. And then lastly, you have the content of those elements. So this is the reason why the document object is important. So just a quick reminder on the structure of the DOM. The very first object, or what I called the root object, is actually being referenced here as the document object again. And so, like I said before, the syntax for each of the methods we just saw is actually connected to the document object. So a quick note before we see the syntax for these methods is the fact that the document object is connected with the methods of the DOM. So I already made mention of that. And also, this connection is what enables a user to access and manipulate HTML elements. So here we have the syntax of the document object together with different methods of the DOM. So for the first method we had that to be the .write method. And you can see the syntax here. It begins with the document object, then .write. So this particular syntax like this can actually be used to output content on your HTML page that's on the browser. And also for the next method, which is the write ln, we also have the document object attached to it. And this syntax like this can be used to write to output content on the HTML page. But the difference with this one is that it outputs the content on a new line. Next, we have the document.get element by ID. This we are already familiar with. So we have the document object and you have the method attached to it. So this particular attachment actually goes across every other method, including the .get element by name method, also with the .get elements by tag name, and lastly the .get elements by class name. So you can see here in the syntax that each of these methods actually begin with the document object here. And that's actually because before you can actually specify the HTML elements you want to manipulate or access, you must begin with the document object first, as I said before. So that's why you have the syntax to be in this way. So a quick note before we move on. For finding HTML elements, we make use of the document.getElement by the following methods. So first we have the ID, we have secondly the name, third we have the tag name, and lastly we have the class name. So all this syntax here are actually connected with the document.getElements or elements by this. So this, for the first one, you would actually have this to be document.getElements by ID. For the name, the tag name, and the class name, you would have them to be document.getElements, because from 2 to 4 you can actually reference multiple HTML elements. But for the first one, which is the ID, you can only reference just one HTML element. And so all of them put together are actually used when it comes to finding HTML elements in JavaScript. So for the document.write and document.writeln, they're actually used for outputting content on the web page. So this means that these two syntax we have here are not connected with any HTML element. They just output their content on the web page directly. So, you know, it's just good that we know the importance of this particular method. So we can say that from 1 to 4 is for finding HTML elements, and the document.write and writeln is only for outputting content on the web page. So for the last section of today's class, we have properties. Now under these sections, we'll be seeing the properties of the DOM, and we'll also see its connection with the documents and the methods we saw previously. So here we have the properties of the DOM, and the properties of the DOM actually allow JavaScript to change and modify the content of HTML elements. So this actually means that the properties are the real parts of the entire JavaScript syntax that would actually allow you to change and modify the content of the HTML element. So for the methods and the objects we learnt about, they are majorly used for accessing or finding. So the documents and the methods are used to access the HTML element or to find the particular one you want to manipulate. Now, after you have found this element, the properties together with the elements will now allow you to change and modify the content of the HTML element. So some examples of these properties are: one, we have the .inner HTML property, which we already know about. Two, we have the .attribute property, and for the third one we have the .style property, which is also still the property of the DOM. Now, before we move on to talk about each of these properties, something we should note here is the fact that the properties of the DOM are actually attached with the document object and the methods of the DOM. And now this attachment can be directly or indirectly. Directly in the sense that if you notice very well, we've made use of the document.get element by ID. And for that particular method, we've actually had the .inner HTML property to be attached with it in terms of the entire syntax. But then for the document.get elements by name, class name, and tag name, the property wouldn't be attached to it directly. You would have the property to be attached to it indirectly through the particular HTML element you want to modify. If you do not understand, no need to worry. I will show you what I really meant by that statement when we get to the practical demo on VS Code. So moving on to the first property, we have the .inner HTML property. Now this property is used to change and replace the content of HTML elements. So I think by now we already know how this particular property actually works. We've made use of it a lot of times. So this particular one isn't new to us, but then for the sake of today's class, we'll be going over, you know, this property again on VS Code. Now we have a very, very brief syntax of everything put together. And as you can see here, we have the document.get element by ID dot inner HTML. Now you can see that the syntax of this property begins with the document object itself. After the document object, you have next the method. And for the sake of simplicity, I decided to go over what we are already familiar with, which is the .get element by ID method. And then lastly, we have the .inner HTML, which is the property here. So you can see that the full syntax here can actually be divided into three concepts. First, we have the document object. Next, we have the method. And lastly, we have the property itself. So a quick example of how this is used is also, similar with the syntax. You begin with the document, the method, and also the property itself, which we are still on now, the inner HTML property. Now within this bracket here, since we are making use of the get element by ID property, method, we're actually going to have the ID name inside the normal brackets, and we've assigned this a value of sale virtual. So what this particular statement will do is that it's going to find elements with an ID name of P1, and it will change the content of that element to sale virtual. Now I know that this particular um example isn't something difficult because we've actually seen similar demonstrations on VS Code, which is also the same to this example here. But then we'll still go over it again for today's class. For the next property, we have the attribute property. Now I know that this particular property is new to everybody. We've not touched this. We probably have not heard about this before. And so this attribute property is used to change the attribute values of HTML elements. So here, what this property actually does is that it actually connects with any HTML element that already has an attribute, and the next thing it does is to alter the value of the attribute already. That is either whether it has been set before or not, it's going to give it a new value. Now here we have a brief syntax of the attribute property, and you can see that the syntax here begins with the document object, which we've already seen today, and also the get element by id method. Now the next thing that follows is the particular attribute you want to change, and you can see that in the example we have here, we are making use of the document.get element by id with the id name of p1, and then we attach the source attribute to this syntax. So what this means is that this particular code that we have in the example would only work if the HTML element has this source attribute. And one of the most popular HTML elements with the source attribute is the image element. So in the example here, we've actually set the value of the entire syntax to my background.jpg. So what this does is that it finds the element with an ID name of P1, and the moment it finds that element, the next thing it does is to change the source value to my background.jpg. So let's assume we had the image element to have a source value of cat.jpg, an already existing image. With this example, we can actually change the image that is already existing on the web page, and I will show you how to do that. Lastly, we have the .style.property. Yeah, it's actually .style.property, but it's still a property on its own within the DOM. And what this property actually does is that it is used to change the style of the CSS, HTML element. So this means that with this property, we can actually change the CSS styling of HTML elements. So either it being an inline CSS style or an external CSS, the JavaScript DOM property here would actually override any styling that already exists before. And so a quick syntax here, you can also see that it begins with the document object. Next, we have the get element by id method, and it is followed by the actual property itself, which is the .style.property. Now, the .style here is actually used here to actually represent that, is the style of the HTML elements you want to really affect. And here where we have the .property, this actually represents the exact style we want to change. So going over to the example, we also have it to begin with the document object, then followed by the method here, which we already know to be get element by id. And next we've defined it with the .style syntax here. Now after you have your .style, you then go over to begin with the exact property you want to change. And here we have this to be .color, which is assigned the value of purple. So what this means is that irrespective of what the HTML element with the ID of P1 already had before, whether it was inline or external CSS or internal CSS, this particular purple color would override any existing color before. And so going over what this example would do is that it's going to find the element with an ID name of P1, and it will change the color of the text within that particular element to purple. So I know for the syntax of the properties, we've only seen how the syntax looks like with the get element by id method. But when we get to the practical demo, I would also show you how the syntax is with the other methods we have in the DOM. And so we've come to the section where we try out everything we've learned so far. So for this, we'd see a quick demo on the document object model. So now we are going back to, VS Code. Okay, so now we are on VS Code and we'll have a new HTML and CSS for this. JavaScript DOM. We'll also have a CSS here too. So the next thing we do here is to, make use of the boilerplate. Now we have HTML. So I'm going to connect this with our CSS. And we'll also connect this with our JavaScript file. So now we have everything set. So the next thing we'll do is we'll actually make use of the methods we've seen today, and we'll begin with the document.write method. Now I know this method, we are already familiar with this. Then let's just go over it one more time. And this particular method would only just output anything that is inside this bracket. So we can actually create a variable name, we assign it a string, and here would output the variable name itself. So rendering this page on the browser, we should expect to see sail virtual. Okay, so we have sail virtual on the screen. Yeah, sail virtual. So for the next method, we'll get to see the document dot write ln. Now this particular method is expected to take the text content on a new line. So we should have JavaScript DOM. Should expect to see this on a new line. Okay, but eventually we have this to be on the same line with the sail virtual. So this was actually how I saw it to be when I was trying it out. I really do not know why it was this way. Let me try repeating this again. If we actually have this to be on the same line as the first one, then that means that it doesn't really have much difference with the document dot write syntax. Okay, so the only difference here is the fact that it gives a kind of spacing here That's between this text and this, because here there's no spacing between both of them. But nevertheless, that's actually how the document.write and write.ln actually work. So the next one would be seen is the document.getElement by ID. And you know what we do first before that? We would have our HTML element with the ID name. So give this an ID of P. We've made use of the P1 already. Let's call this paragraph 1. Here we have the document.get element by ID, which is followed by the ID name, paragraph 1 dot. Now for the property, we'll make use of the inner HTML, and this would give us a string within our paragraph element. Say good morning everyone. So going back to our browser, we should have the text above. Okay, we do not. Okay, and that's because we have a space here. So now we should have it. Okay, I'm really surprised how this is, but then you can always check the console.log to see where we have an error, and we can see here type error cannot set properties of null inner HTML. So that means we actually have an issue here. Okay, so probably comment this out to begin the whole thing. Okay, let's just change this to P1. And here we have this to be P1. So this actually begins with document.get element by ID. Then we have the ID name of P1 as we have here, and also dot inner HTML. So I think this should actually work now. Okay, so we have good morning everyone. Yeah, so this actually works. So I don't know if it actually has something to do with the document or write ln that we have here. Let's see. Okay, so all this still renders on the browser, and also let's see this one. Okay, so everything now actually works. So the next thing we'll be trying out is the other properties. So before we move on, I'm going to add some styling to this particular p tag here. So I'm going to comment this out for now. So we have our idea of p, and then we'll have some text. I would make use of some dummy text lorem 5, this will give us just this text here. So right now without JavaScript, we actually have this text to be on the screen. That's this. Next thing I'll do is to add some styling to it. We'll change the color of this to blue, and the font family will probably be cedar. Also add a font style to this, italic. And now we should have all these styles actually affecting our text. So this CSS. Let's give this
You use the class selector in the CSS.
Oh shit. Okay. Sorry. Wow. My bad. How did I not know this? Anyway, thank you very much. I don't know how I could forget that. But anyway, so this okay, so this actually works now. Okay, so the next thing I want to do now is to make use of the JavaScript property to actually change the styling of this. So let me see if I uncomment this now. I'm actually going to remove this inner HTML. I'm not going to make use of this for now. Now we'll have the style dot property. Okay, the property we want, not dot property. And so I want to change the color now to red. That's the color of our text. So if I save this now, rather than having the blue color, we are supposed to actually have a red ink for this lorem ipsum text here. And now we have this to be in red color. So I'm actually going to make multiple changes on this text, and you will actually see that you can make use of more than one property at a time. So I'm going to have document to get elements by ID, which would still be the one of P1, but here we'd have dot inner HTML, and we'll give this a separate string completely, a new string completely. So now we should expect to see good morning class in red ink on the browser. Yeah, so we have this to be good morning class. So this is how JavaScript can actually help change the styling of CSS, CSS styles of HTML elements. So the last property we've not touched is the dot attributes, and that's because the P element by default doesn't have any attributes per se. But let's quickly see other methods. So for the next method, we have that to be document dot get element by class name. Now we already know that class names can be repeated throughout different HTML properties. So for this, we are going to have different HTML properties here. We would have a heading 3, heading 4, probably with a heading 2 also. And we'll give each of these elements the same class name. So what should I call this? Let's say head. So now they all have the same class names. And you can give them any text we want here. Let's just go with something very, very brief. Let's just go get days of the week. Days, Wednesdays, days. And so we can also go ahead to style all this if we want to be dot head.
Yeah, sir. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yep.
Hello, sir.
Yes, I'm listening.
Yes, sir. This the external JavaScript. I noticed that you always um, link it on the body of the HTML document.
Yes.
Can it also be on the head tag?
Yes, it can also be on the head tag, but let me show you what would happen if we have it there. So now I'm going to cut this and I'll place this at the head. Now if I save this, you can see what we have now. We have this to be in blue color the way it was before. So what this means is that having your script tags within the head will not necessarily affect your HTML element. It's why it's always better to put it in the body tag. And I think this is actually because of the structure of the DOM. Now, from what I explained today about the DOM begins its structure from top to bottom. That's in terms of how it renders this page. So it begins with everything from here, here, then this. Now, once it gets to this JavaScript that we have here, the moment it gets here and it sees some kind of syntax that are connecting to HTML elements, it would look at the top to see if the HTML elements are there. Now, if they don't appear there, that's all. It just moves on and then just renders all this we have. But in order for us to affect the HTML elements, it's always better we have the script tags below it right here, so that when it gets here, it looks up for the HTML elements and it sees that they are all here. So that's why you need to have your script tags inside the body and before the HTML elements.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I want to
Thank you.
move on to how this actually works. So now we have the following text here. That's Mondays to Thursdays, and they are all being rendered with different HTML elements but with the same class name. So hopefully we'll give this a color, probably green. Should you also change the font size? I don't know. 8 pixels. Okay, so right now all the texts are being affected. Okay, so now we have all of them appearing this way, Mondays to Thursdays, having green color and a font size of 30 pixels irrespective of their elements. So the next thing I'm going to do is to make use of this class name. So after this class name, we would have within the bracket the actual class name we want to affect. And our class name here has a name of head. Is it head? Okay, yes, the class name here is head. Now, unlike the document or get element by ID where you would have dot, the whole thing on one line, this would not work for this. And that's because this particular syntax affects multiple elements. And so what this means is that you cannot style all the elements together. So let me just quickly try to do something like that. So give this dot inner HTML and we change this to Friday. So this means that we should have every HTML element that has a class name of head to output the string of Friday on the screen. And as you can see, that doesn't turn out to be so. We do not have Friday anywhere here. And so this actually probably would make reference to the fact that HTML elements are also objects. So yes, HTML elements are objects. Now I'm not trying to confuse you because I know we learnt about objects last week, but we already know that you cannot output all the values of an object on the screen. You can only output them one at a time. So that particular kind of mechanism is what is happening here to this element. That's via this method. So to actually change the inner HTML of these classes we have here, we'd have to do that one after the other. And so a very quick way to do that is to actually assign this entire statement to a variable name. So create a variable name xy and you would assign it this entire syntax here. So this would stop at this bracket here exactly like this. Now if you notice very well, going back to our HTML, we have 4 HTML elements with the same class name. So these HTML elements can actually be referenced by their index numbers. So what this means is that to reference this particular P element, it has an index of 0. The heading 3 here has an index of 1. Heading 4 has an index of 2. And the heading 2 has an index of 3. So to do this, all I need to do is to just say xy inside the square brackets. Let's just have the first element which has an index of 0, and then you can actually have the property you want to change. So this will be dot inner HTML, and we'll give this string of Friday. So right now this should only affect the very first element with the class name. And now you can see we have Friday right here. So here we have Friday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So mind you, this doesn't only work for the .inner.html property, but it also works for the CSS styling. So we are going to have it again, xy index of 0 dot style dot, let's change the color since we have a green color. We would have this to be purple. Ah, yeah, so now we have the Friday text here to be in purple color as opposed to the rest which are in green color. So we can actually have more than one, styling to this. We could still add a new one, dot style dot, what other styles could we have? Let's say text We use text decoration. Any other thing you want to add here, you can actually add them. So let's just go with a new one. Would style the third item, which has an index of 2. But this would only change the let's just change the size. This would be 10 pixels. Okay, so this doesn't affect this, and I'm guessing that's because of the ones we have here already. Okay, this is actually meant to be font size and not size. And we can't have a space here. So how does this work? Okay, it's a dash font size.
I think if you use the camel case,
O-
more or less,
Yeah, the
it
camel
works.
case might not work because by default CSS has it to be dash. But let's see. 30, okay, we already have it to be in 30 pixels, 10 pixels. Okay, so it doesn't pick, but nevertheless, you can actually style your CSS with JavaScript using this. Only thing is you might not be able to style, properties that have this dash attached to it, since JavaScript already interprets this as a minus symbol. So I think that's actually enough with the class name. Let's go on and see the tag name. And the tag name also begins with document.get element by tag name. So for this, we'll be making changes to the p elements. I think we have two of them. Okay, yeah, we have two, one at the top and one right here. So hopefully whatever we set here should override the existing um you know text or color they have. And this particular syntax is also going to be similar to the class name we have here, since we can't style everything together. So we'd also assign this a variable name, and now we'll make reference to the very first key element. So we'll change the content inner HTML. We'll change this to Saturday. So now we have Saturday here. Now this particular text that was here before has changed from Monday to Friday and now to Saturday. And we made this change by making reference to the tag name. Now you would know that going back to our HTML, you can see that this p tag here has a class name of head, which we have already styled, and we've also made changes to this using the class name. But now we've made use of the tag name of p, and that's why we have Saturday on the screen instead of Friday, although it still retains this purple color. But if I should make changes to that too, give this orange. Yeah, so this will give us an orange color now. So the thing here is this: the more methods you keep adding into your syntax, the more it would keep overriding the previous ones that were already there. So this is actually how the class name works and how the tag name also works. So to style another element, all you need to do is to just make reference to the next one And since we have just two paragraphs, this will be AB of 1. Now this particular one represents this second P element we have here. That's this one. Can also have dot inner HTML, change this to Sunday. Okay, so we have Sunday right here in this P tag. So that's actually how the dot get elements by tag name actually work. And so you can see that the properties are actually connected to this document and method name indirectly and not directly like the dot get element by id here. So the last one we have is the dot get element by name. So I don't know, should I do I need to create a form for this? Probably. Label input. I think just three is enough. Input. Okay, so can I have the name here? Give this first name, will be last underscore name. Email. Last name. Email. Okay, so we have this to be this way. I'll just add some BR tags so I don't need to go through the whole thing. Okay, let's add more BR. Okay, so we have this very short form here. And so we're making use of the very last method we've not touched. And that's the document dot get element by name. So here we would have the name we want to make reference to, which is f underscore name. So this also works like the document or get element by tag name and class name. You cannot style everything together. So I would also assign this to a variable AA, and then I would make reference to the very first element with that particular class name. So before we actually do that, let me go back and check. Okay, we have the f underscore name here in this input. You know, this input here. I'll probably change this to text area. Oh, okay, this to be address. Okay, so the text area here would have a name of address. Okay, okay, yeah. So this is what we have now. Probably reduce this. So when I make changes, I would actually see what I'm changing. This would be 5. Okay, so we have our text area to be like this. Now, mind you, the form might not look very nice, but then that's not why we are here. We're only here to see how JavaScript can actually manipulate this particular input we have here. So this name here would be address and not first name anymore. Now we change the style, but pose, that's column. We'll set this to 40. I don't know if the cause of column actually works. Let me see. Columns. Hmm. Okay, it doesn't. That's probably because the cause property here, that's this, doesn't appear there. But no problem with that anyway. Okay, it doesn't work here. So this should actually return the length of the properties with the name of address. Should have just one. Okay, so this particular name doesn't really well do so well here, and I'm guessing that's because there are not much properties with the name attributes, and I don't really know what kind of styling is attached to the input tag or text area. But at least we've seen how the get element by class name and tag name actually works. So I think the last thing we have is the dot attribute. So let me see if we have any image here. Should have some images before. Okay, we have this one. Copy this. Nope. Okay, this is another. Yeah. So copy these two images to our current destination. Okay, so we have these two images now in our current file. So I think for to end this class, I would actually show how the attribute property actually works. So now that we have it here, I'll get rid of this form. I'll make use of the image. So this will be cat.jpg. Give this a width 200 pixels. What will be cat image. Okay, so we have the cat image somewhere here. So I think for the sake of this, I'll comment all this out. And this also. So I can actually have the image on one screen. Okay, so we have the image here. That's this particular picture. So now I would have the document dot get elements by ID. I'll make use of the ID name first. And the next thing I'll do is to give this image an ID name. The ID will be my underscore image. Image. This will be dot src, as we are making reference now to the source attribute. So here the source attribute has cat.jpg, but I'll be changing this to a different image in our JavaScript. And so this would be Lagos underscore pic dot jpg. So now we shouldn't have the cat image here. We should actually have the Lagos buses here. Yeah. And as you can see here, the image has actually changed from the cat to this. And so this can also apply to the styling or the other attributes we have to this image. So another thing I'm going to do, document.get element by ID, also my image, but I think we have the width here. Yeah, so the width here is 200 pixels. The width here will be set to 100 pixels. Now I'm not so sure if this would work, but if it doesn't work with the attribute property, then it should work with the style dot property. Okay, so it doesn't. So this means we probably use the dot style dot weight for this. Okay, so this actually works, and now we have the image right here. That's at the top, I mean at the bottom left corner of the screen. Although it appears here to be in a smaller width than we actually set it to be. So this is actually how the DOM works across different HTML elements with the get elements by ID. We saw the get element by class name, get elements by tag name, except for the get elements by name, which only works with elements that have the name attributes. But then if you know any styling that actually works with that, you can try that out on your own. But like I said, this is just an introductory class to the DOM. the dome can actually do much more sophisticated operations than these basic ones here. So, but hopefully we've been able to grasp the very basic of how the dome is, and hopefully probably we might see other, methods and properties within the dome. Thank you, and you know